Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back in room 9 for the next session, Business Central Performance Toolkit, presented by Bardur, Henrik, and Simon. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I'm on here, yeah. Good afternoon, and welcome to this 45-minute presentation on our Performance Toolkit. It's great to see you all. We have a packed agenda. First, we're going to introduce some of the reasons for why you should invest in performance testing, and maybe also just the rest of the tool family. We'll take you through some basics around the tool. Then we're going to cover a customer story and some findings from that. Then we're going to look into the analysis of the data, which is really the gem, obviously, in a performance toolkit, is also to be able to pull out the data and make use of it. So let's get started. Why should you invest in performance testing? We invest in it. So back home in Copenhagen, we use performance testing. And so I just dumped in a small diagram here, or graph. And each of these lines represents a scenario that we have. It could be like post a sales invoice, post a purchase order, open up something, do another thing. And then if one of these spikes that you see would remain there for more than 3 times, 3 builds, 3 days, we would actually log a bug, and then a developer would need to pick it up and take a look at what could have happened. And we do that based on the churn that we have in our source depot. Anyway, another one is that logging can be difficult to detect. If you are just a single user on a system and you try out different things, it might just work perfect. In a system with maybe hundreds of concurrent users, this can be quite different. Then there is the diversity in the solutions out there, because you can have many third-party extensions, or you can have some. Your scenarios might vary depending on your vertical. What are the problems that your solution is testing? And so there might be other third-party extensions on top of what you already have. So how does that actually perform? Then there is another one, the impact release over release, as I just showed up here. We also, too, discover some regressions. I think in the past 6 months, we logged something like 35 bugs against our own team to go in and evaluate and bring it back. And then performance tests can also be reused, and this is an important part, because obviously you want to be able to reuse the test that you write at the very beginning, if you think about a project. And then it moves on and it matures, and we put it into more like a company simulation test, which I will also cover just briefly. And then finally, you might use something like CI/CD. And then support engineering. No engineer like to ship low-performing code, so that's another good way to support ourselves. And then the final, that there's this what-if scenarios, and this is typically when you're approached by maybe a prospect, and they have a lot of questions about, can the system perform this and that? So we'll talk a bit about that as well. So let's see. As I mentioned, we use it internally. CI/CD. Every pull request that we have, we run a number of tests. I just took an old one here. But this is an example of a pull request. It ran some tests during our body build process, and now it says, wait a minute, you introduced a regression. Please sign off that you are okay with this regression, because it could also be that we are actually okay with this regression. Then, as I mentioned, we'd also use it build over build. So this is actually once it's gotten in, and now we're using it more like a full system, right? Remember I said it was maybe you post a sales invoice, so now it's in the scenario. Okay, so when should you use this performance toolkit? We think you should use it from the very beginning, but you can imagine some of these questions come up. Is the solution performant enough for the cloud? What is the performance impact from current and future customizations? And not just customizations. I would also say think about other things, like maybe the company is adding more users, Maybe they're adding more reports, more data. So there are many things that can change in the real world, and this is where it can become useful. What is the performance impact between major upgrades? As I said, any churn can introduce a regression. That's a good thing to keep a tight eye on. Can the system handle posting 20,000 invoices per day? It's a good question. Actually, this is some of the questions I often get in my inbox, and the short answer is yes. But really, it requires us to do a lot more analysis because we don't know. We simply don't know how the system is being used, what extensions are out there, how many users, etc. So there are so many factors. So can the system, for instance, handle 700 concurrent users? And these are all relevant questions, right? It's just hard to answer them without actually knowing, without actually trying out the system. So this could be some of the questions you can address with us. Anyway, I wanted to also touch on this reuse because I think that's also an important aspect of this, because we don't want you to kind of first create test, then another set of tests, and then some performance test at the end of it, and then what do you do with those? Throw them away? Or so we're thinking about how you can reuse your investment. So here you can see a simple extension I stole from our, I think it's Get Up and Running with your first extension. And this is where you can start applying your performance test, right? Very early. These tests can then go into this, what we call sort of the company simulation. This is a spreadsheet I borrowed from the customer story that Bardur will actually cover. But this just shows a bunch of scenarios, a lot of data about the expectations to the system and how that actually performed during the test. So that's another place where you can reuse your test. And then finally, if you saw the keynote this morning, Freddie presented his ALGO. And we are now also part of that, so we have our own GitHub action to include our performance test and run these. So it's also these tests, they're also useful with the rest of our toolbox. Maybe you saw this morning as well. We have the performance profiler, the incline performance profiler. So when you discover something, you can actually start this profiler, you can run your BCBT test, and then you can stop it again, and then you can go into that with the profile file. And that means you can also utilize the AL profiler. Then again, as I mentioned, we have this ability now to add the performance test into these pipelines. So every time we basically do a pull request in our GitHub, we can get some results from that. Soon, we will introduce the report that I showed kind of this snippet about where you had the graph there. We're going to introduce that, so we are going to put it out there, so whenever you have a build, you can actually go in and monitor it, build over build. And then finally, this new app that was also, I think, shown today. We are also adding support for BCBT. So the telemetry you generate, you will be able to pick that up in the performance tab, and then you can see how your latest build performed, basically. So it is sort of part of the toolbox family, and there is a reuse for your test. So the investment can basically live for as long as your setup is alive, you could say. One thing I may also mention is that once you've done this, you can also use it as part of a sort of, I would say, external sales pitch, right? I mean, our solution is performant. We can do this and that with that many concurrent users. Might also be useful. So I just want to cover a bit of the company simulation, because that is really sort of the basics of the whole tool. Why did we build it in the first place? That was to cover this, because stress test is available. We have tests that can test everything in a single unit. We have scenario tests, but what we are really missing is this whole system, right? It's about getting all the scenarios lined up. Think about, can a user actually perform 200 purchase orders in 2 minutes? Probably not. and it's probably not what the users are actually doing. Even though you might have web services from a web store, we can still push that into the system. But the point is that the tool itself, you may have a scenario first you want to define. The scenario could be a user goes to the role center, they open up the customer list. From the customer list, they may create a new document, could be a new order, quote, invoice. In this case, I just said, okay, they're going to release the sales order and then they're going to post and send an invoice. Maybe not that typical, maybe it is, but at least it's a scenario end-to-end, right? It represents a user. And then another thing to consider is what are the peak hours during the day? Because I would say probably in most cases, you would have something, this may not be super realistic, but as an example, you can think about it. So if we look at maybe some of the busy periods of time, I don't know if this can be read actually, you can see it's quite small. But if you look between 10 and 11, that's the third column, we are quite busy as a company. This is based on a conversation, fictive conversation we had with a customer, for instance, a client. And then between 4 and 5, again, we are also super busy. And this is because in that hour, we simulate that we have a bunch of consultants coming home, reporting the hours from today. And so if we had to go in and say, okay, what would be the key 2 hours of the day that we should go in and simulate using this performance toolkit, those would be the 2 hours that we would go in and take a look at and try and emulate in our setup. So the next thing is obviously what are the acceptable numbers, right? I mean, is acceptable, is that 3 seconds for a page to open? Is it 1 second? How long time does it take to post something? We need to define those because the client may say, well, that is acceptable. To run certain reports, it's okay. It takes 5 minutes, no problem. Other things they might want to have just like that. So we need to define those goals. We also need to talk about what are the environment that we're going to test in, because we can use sort of at least 3 different ways to test this, right? We can use the on-prem, which is just from the DVD image, and then we just simply install it, get it up and running. We could also use Docker. And finally, we could use a sandbox, because we do not support production. I won't cover sort of parity, but I just want to say that parity between prod and sandbox is roughly the same. The key difference is basically the SQL tier. Other than that, the performance is roughly the same. Anyway, we need to define some test runs. When are we going to do this? How are we going to do it? And then finally, the investigations. This is the analysis part that we need to come back to. Yeah, and that kind of, Simon, I guess I want to put you on now to talk a bit about the how-tos.
So, yeah, the mic is on. Okay, so now we talked a bit about kind of the introduction, why you should use the toolkit. So I just wanted to quickly cover a bit about how we use it and how it works, and also some details about the test. So let me just go in to my environment. Okay, so in here, this is probably the main, okay. So this is probably the main area where you're gonna be working. So this is the BCT suite. And what is that? Well, you can think of it as a scenario or a company simulation. So the main thing you might be working with here is the suite lines. And there's nothing magic about this. It's basically just a code unit that this tool will orchestrate and run for you. So again, we provide some sample tests that you can use. They're not extensive, and take them more as an inspiration for what your own test. But basically, the main things you will be looking at is the number of sessions. So what is that? That's basically a user. So in my scenario, I have 2 users that are basically creating purchase orders. So you can think of them, they're running in concurrently. They're running at the same time doing their purchase order. And then we have this option regarding running in foreground, because one of the things we support is page testability. I don't know, has anyone worked with page testing before? A few, okay. So we will actually, you can reuse this in these tests, but there's a limitation. So it has to run in the foreground. We do not support doing client interactions in the background. So that's why the checkbox is here. Also, if you want to do some client profiling, if some of your code runs in the background, it will not be captured. So that's just a thing. And then the other important aspect is about the delay between iterations. So when a user is done, creating their purchase order, they're not going to go immediately and create a new one. That is not very realistic because, again, this is not a stress tool. It's a tool for simulating workloads you might expect from your customer. So this is one thing you will be working with. Now I set it to 5. That's maybe pretty unrealistic, or maybe it is. I don't know about you, but I cannot create a sales order or purchase order every 5 seconds. And then the other thing you have is some other fields on the suite. So another very useful thing is the tag, because when you run the suite, it will generate a lot of log entries. And then you can use the tag to basically differentiate between your runs. So in this case, I have a baseline run, and then I might install some extensions and run it again. And that will give me, and then I can later, when I analyze the log entries, I can, distinguish between them and see the difference. And while we're at it, let's go in here in the log entries. You will see from my last run, of course, you can just clear the filter. This will just be set by default. But then you can have a look here, or you can export it and use Excel or Power BI. And of course, if you have some issues, you can go in and filter and say, okay, what was running at the same time when this happened? Very useful when you're dealing with logging issues, because often it will be someone else logging your resource. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. And just skip this in case nothing worked. I would have it here. Okay. So one thing you have to think about is when you run it from client, that's very useful for early testing. But sometimes, there are some limitations with Business Central. And one of the things is, again, if you're using page testability, you can only run one session at a time. And another thing is that we have limitations of how many background jobs can run concurrently. I think in the cloud, it's set to 10. So again, if you're working with bigger scenarios, we have to do something else. And if we think about it, so what's actually happening when we are doing, when the users are using the product? And in here, you can see we have a very simplified view of how the Business Central is running. So we have some load balancer in the cloud, and then we have several instances of the NST and the web server. And of course, your database. So what happens is many users, they come in and they're gonna, through the client, they're gonna go in and hit the load balancer and it will distribute it out. And we want something similar when we're doing our performance testing. So what we came up with was a PowerShell script, which will basically, there we go, try and do the same. So you will run the suite from the PowerShell, and the PowerShell will go in and emulate these client sessions. So it will create several jobs that will run in parallel, which use the web client endpoint to go in and try as much as possible to simulate the user load. So let's talk a little bit about, okay, now we've seen it, how it works, what's the concept, but how do you actually get started? And it's very simple. You install an extension that we have, and you can get it from when you're setting up your Docker, you can get it installed by default. Or on-prem, it might already be there. If you go into extension management, you might see it there. It's just not installed, so you can go in and publish it. Otherwise, you can get it from the app source or extension marketplace, what you want to call it. It's available there. And of course, if you want to take what we've created and modify it for your needs, we have it available on GitHub. The same with our sample tests. They're also available here, so you can go in and get them. But of course, we wanted to make it easier for you to get started with it. And I don't know how many attended the keynote earlier today. Okay, so you might already have seen it, but just for those of you who didn't, I'm just going to quickly show you the video again. So what we have created is VS Code extension to help you get started. So in here, I have my cloud environment. Then I go into VS Code. I install the extension. Then I select which environment I want to target. And then in this case, I'm going against the cloud. So as you know, with the AL developer tool, you have to use the device login to authenticate. And once this is done, it's going to go in and read my environments and find the sandbox environments. Again, we only support sandbox. We don't want to mess with the production. And then you just pick where you want the sample project to be located. It's going to go in, get the sample tests we have, renumber them to so you don't have to do that yourself. I don't know. I think it can be painful sometimes to find a number available. And then it's going to set up your project and copy the PowerShell scripts that you're going to need. Otherwise, you would also have to find those yourself. And when this is done, you will, in a second, have your project ready with all the sample tests, the PowerShell scripts, and all the configurations you need. So you're just good to go. But not only that, we also wanted to make it easier for you to then run the test from PowerShell, because we had a workshop earlier, and we can see it can be a bit cumbersome to enter all these parameters and so on, and maybe you forgot something. So from this extension, you can also just, with very few efforts, run the simulation, and it will set up things for you and do it. So yeah, and again, we provide a lot of samples, some examples of the pace testability. But again, they're not complete. They're only to give you some inspiration. So, but of course, it's on GitHub. So please go in and maybe contribute with your own samples you would like to share with the community. But anyways, we support basically 2 ways. So if you've been writing a unit test or something like that, you already might have something like this, or maybe that you can use. And again, if you're using page testability, the only difference is basically, so instead of doing all this init and assigning fields and insert, we're just using kind of the same actions as the user would. And then, of course, we want good data. So you should add some, it's basically like a stopwatch. So you can add some, for example, up here, it's inserting the sales header, and then we end the scenario, we are done inserting. And then it will create a log entry, as you saw earlier, with that scenario name. And that gives you basically some probing into like how many SQL calls are being used and what is the time it took to do it. So that's all you have to do with your existing test. And of course, you can also write your own ones from scratch. And then you get a bunch of log files. And you can do it from here, but you can also export it and play a bit around with, for example, pivot tables in Excel. Bardur will cover that later. But yeah, so that's basically a bit about the tool and the tests. And now Bardur, he will like to talk a bit about one of our partners, 4PS, and what they have done with this tool. Thank you.
He's not done yet. So this tool has been out for a couple of years, and a year and a half ago maybe. 4PS, who's one of our bigger partners in Holland, maybe some of you know them. They're in the construction industry, and they were approached by a prospect who said that they had 700 and something users. And would we be able to handle 700 users in SaaS with their solution? And I mean, we don't know, right? Or we didn't know, I would rather say. So what 4PS then did, together with us, was that they had workshops with the customer, and exactly as Henrik explained, tried to identify how many concurrent users will there be at any given point in time. That also includes mobile users and whatever they have, web services. what are they doing, all these users that are on. Again, remember Henrik's chart, what happens during the day. You know, every Friday afternoon, a lot of people enter hours, for instance. Web services or Power BI or whatever you have of external services, payroll maybe. What is good enough? So Henrik also hinted at that. So is field validation time of 1 second good enough? Maybe, maybe not, depends. What's the transactional volume or work volume, or whatever you would call it? How many customer inquiries will they be doing during the day? All these things need to be modeled. So they had created big Excel sheets. This goes on for hundreds of lines, and there are many more columns, and we're not going through it, but just to say that this is how they work with their customer. And we're also not going to read that, just to point out that even every line has a lot of details. So you need to do a proper work upfront to plan this. And this is a small screenshot of, just a part of, if you remember what Simon showed, you have the lines in that suite. So these lines also go on, long way down. And I don't know if you can read it there. So all these number of sessions sum up to almost 800 for them with our bigger simulation. And they were running it, they export to Excel, analyzed, and so on. And they were also interested in does the system scale with number of users. So for them, it was important to see how are things looking with 25, 50, and 100% load. But it could also have been other things they had differentiated. Again, think of the tag field that Simon talked about. So you don't need to read this because all these scenarios are specific to 4PS. But then they got, graphs like these, and they could analyze them and, discuss with the customer, is this good enough, or yes or no? And it was. So while they were running this, we had provisioned an environment for them without any other customers, so it was completely clean environment, because then there wouldn't be any noise from other customers. And I mean, to be honest, we were as interested in these numbers as they were, because we had no clue of whether we could support 700 users. We do know that, though, that on a normal environment with many tenants, we have thousands of users. So it's not because we are afraid, generally speaking, but one customer with 700, that was interesting. So there are two graphs. One from the NSTs, and you can see each color is a different machine. So you can see some load balancing kicks in. And you can see that none of the machines ever really exceeds, I don't know what that is, 5-10% CPU load. So it's definitely not CPU bound. You can clearly see on the database load when they were running the tests. So each test is an hour, pretty intense, but still only 20-ish% of our load. And this was deemed good enough. I mean, the response times that we saw before were good enough. We could see that the CPU load was good enough. So the customer was convinced. Their migrations were done, people educated, they went live, and time passed. And a month later, or whatever it was, we took a look at actual data from a couple of days. So that's not hours, that's 2 days you have there. And obviously, reality doesn't look exactly like test. But you can see that, in the bigger picture, CPU rarely goes above 10%, right? In the database, obviously, the pattern is different from when you run an intense simulation. But still, 10-20% database load during the day, during busy hours. So, at least from our point of view, that was a great thing to see. So, the next part is analysis. So you saw Simon running or defining, or rather say, tests in the sheet. So how do we analyze? Because we want something like that, right? So first of all, short look at the log entries again. Simon already showed them. So in there we have the tag, because we want each measurement to be labeled with something we can use later for analysis. So baseline or warm-up or 25% usage or 100% usage or whatever. Then we have the version number, which is every time we run, we increment the version, so we can distinguish each simulation from each other, regardless of tagging. Then we have, how long did it take? We have the start and end time, and then the code unit number, which is not really useful here, but we have the code unit name for the test, and so that's point number one. If you do this, give the code unit good names, because you want the Excel sheets or the analysis to look nice, the result. Then, Simon also hinted at, we have, so a code unit.run, simply speaking, that's what we call a scenario. So, like this one, right? This is code unit.run. And then in between, we have these stopwatches. They can even be overlapping if that's needed. So in this case, we say start scenario at order, and then we do stuff, and then we say end scenario at order. And then some time later, we say start scenario, enter, basically it says customer number, right? And then we validate the customer number, modify true commit, and then we stop the stopwatch, if you will. So, and again, you can say, I didn't say enter customer number. I said enter account number. And that's because it's also nice to be able to analyze across scenarios, because if you have a purchase order, it's not a customer number, right? And then it's a vendor number. So remember to use good naming for these as well as the tags up there. So, and this is kind of what Henrik already went through. What is it you want to measure? Is it many users, or is it, whatever it is? UI responsiveness, scenario duration, how long does it take to run a report? And as I just said, think of what the end result is you want to see. I mean, use good naming for the tags and fields and so on. Then let's just jump into the client that we had here. So when you look at the log entries here, so depending on what you want to analyze, you can, for instance, use the version number to filter. And by default, it's always filtered to the latest version, because usually you're interested in what happened now. But you can, remove this filter if you want to. Clear filter. Could also be that you want to filter on tag or whatever. But in our client, we have this completely standard. All list pages have this. Open in Excel, right? Which will basically, save this to the folder where you have downloads. And I will open it there. And so if you mark everything, and what we experienced in the last two workshops is that not everyone is familiar with pivot tables. So I'll quickly show you how to create a pivot table. You mark whatever you want. Click Insert, Pivot Table. I want that in a new sheet. And so now what do you want to see? Well, we did remember to give the code unit names good names. So we take that as rows. And you can see it's immediately populated. And I will increase the size so you can also read it. You remember we had something called scenario and other measurements. So what we want to do is we want to be able to filter. So we have this operation thing, that's the scenario. We want that as a filter. And you can say I only want to filter on scenario in this case. And our real price here is the duration, but not the sum of duration, obviously. We want the average. And so you can say, click on field settings, and then you can click average. And what you can also do, you can add more of these. Actually, you can copy this field several times because you can add the average, but you can even say, I also want the standard deviation or variation or whatever you prefer. Or min and max, that's also interesting. Maybe you are interested in max numbers. I don't want a lot of decimals. Actually, I want none, because we are talking about milliseconds, so something comma something milliseconds is close to irrelevant. So, creating purchase order, I mean, these tests took approximately 3/4 of a second, and sales order a second, and open a list took, that was quick. And now we also have the tag. So we click tag, and we can take the tags out as columns. Okay. Yep. Excel sorts things alphabetically, so 100% comes before 25, which comes before 50. So if you want this ordered more natural, you might add a 0 in front or add some letter, A 25, B 50, C 100, or whatever you can do, or maybe you don't care. And creating a chart which looks better always. Just click insert, pivot chart, and Excel always seems to select the best or suggest the best option. So in this case, you can see this is how it evolves with number of users, or whatever it is you're looking at. Also, you remember we did put in these other stopwatch things. So we can also say, I don't want to look at the code unit that run. I want to see line quantity, for instance, right? Because sometimes, I don't know what business you are in, but if you have reservation entries or assembly orders, it can be quite heavy to change it. And apart from the purchase order being quicker than sales order, it seems to be linear, or the flat. I mean, it's not linear, it's flat with number of users. So I think you can play around with this endlessly. So I will quickly go back to the presentation because we don't have that much time left. Yeah. So there are things you need to be aware of. There are some pitfalls which Simon will entertain about.
Can you hear me?
No. I can repeat what you're saying.
There we go. Okay. I'm sorry we're a bit over time, so I'll have to go through a bit quickly. So I don't know about you, but when I start on new things and developing, everything sounds so nice and dandy, but there's never real life. There's always some caveats and gotchas you kind of have to think about. So the first thing is, of course, you might just use the demo data when you're doing your initial testing. Just remember, the number series ranges are quite small, so just try and extend them before you do these testing, or you will run out of numbers and get errors. And then a more common thing also is about logging, which is not caused by your production code, but rather by the testing itself. So the test code you make, think of it as when do you actually do a transaction? Because you will not go in, if a user goes and do stuff on their document, every time they move around, you will save the document and the transaction completes. So, and often we tend to just, go ahead and just fill out everything in one go, and that's fine for the production code, but when you're actually testing, you want to simulate a real scenario. So just think about keeping the transactions limited so they actually reflect what happens for a user. And then, of course, the number series. I don't know, does anyone know about the allow gaps in number series? Few ones, okay. Very important thing, because when you get a number from the number series, we're actually logging that during when we pick the number. And of course, in certain cases, you want that. You want to be sure that you get numbers without gaps in sequentially until the transaction's finished. The next one can get a number because it's required by law, like posted sales invoices. But sometimes you don't need it. And then you should enable allow gaps, because then you will use the number sequence from SQL, and that was a non-logging operation. But of course, if your transaction fails, there's a gap in the number. And finally, SIF keys. We have, if you're aware of that, SIF keys creates a view in SQL, and when you update something, it will update the view, and during that transaction, those rows that are affected are locked. So when you write your test, don't hard code, item values, which item you're selling, what customer you're going to use, because that's not realistic either. And then you get a lot of logging if you have SIF keys involved, for example. And again, think about user activity is not a stress tool or stress tester. It is for realistic loads. So we're probably not creating a sales order every 10 seconds. And finally, think about background stuff. If you have a web shop, it might ping your server, stuff like that. Just keep that in mind. And finally, two more or less obvious things is when you actually run many user sessions, you might actually get resource starvation on your machine. So you might have to split it up in two. And page testability can be a bit unstable. For those of you who have worked with it, you probably already know that pain. So make those simple and predictable so you don't get errors because of the test failing. So that was a lot of talks, and we went through from why you should use it, the customer scenarios and user story and so on. I hope you got a lot of good stuff out of this. So just to conclude, the Performance Toolkit is a very useful tool to help you determine whether or not a customer case is feasible. It gives you that confidence, and also you can convince your customer that you will be able to deliver a performance solution. And another important thing is, it is also important to think about whether this customer is feasible, is